Well, good morning, Riverbend in the house. And good morning, Riverbend online. And good morning, Riverbend on Wednesday on your rowing machine. Right? We deliver in all kinds of ways. I'm grateful to be with you. I'm Alan Hilton, and so I get to preach here every once in a while because I'm a member who also has done some preaching in my life. And so I was trying to figure out why Dave wanted me to preach today, and entering the mind of Dr. Dave Haney is a difficult thing. There's a lot going on in there. There's a lot going on. But I have a feeling we're going to talk today about some of the the challenge of change in a church. Right? What is it to change the times of worship, change certain staff, change some of the ways that we're doing worship when some people have been doing it that way for years and have grown used to the furniture and the way things are. And it's dear to their hearts. And others of you feel untouched and you just we have to come at a different time? Okay, right? Where do I go? And there's a lot of land between those two. I have a feeling that Dave asked me to talk about this for a couple reasons. One is I am a member. I'm not a part of the staff. Every once in a while I preach, but I'm not a part of Riverbend staff. So I'm adjusting, my family's adjusting as you are adjusting as a member of the congregation. The second thing is I do a lot of work. My day job is to help people navigate spaces of conflict, and especially red-blue conflict. In a nation that's politically polarized, what I do is go around the nation and help churches and corporations and civic groups and schools figure out how do we talk to one another across lines of difference, sometimes racial, mostly red-blue. And so I do a lot of work with conflict, and I have a feeling that might have been part of why Dave thought today might be a good day to do this. I do know that we've been planning for this day and this passage for weeks. Those of you who've been around at all know that the preaching team, and I got to do one of these, the preaching team has been preaching for 12 weeks, is it, Dave? 12 weeks on the 11th chapter of Hebrews alone. And the question was constantly, what does faith look like there? What does faith do there? And many of you are nodding your head like I was here for every one, right? It's a big, long chapter of kind of a hall of fame of faith. So we see Noah build a boat, and Enoch walk with God, and Abraham and Sarah move house, and all these people who ventured out, with giving some risk to it, ventured out in faith. Then last week was this magnificent explosion. I had to be in Denver working with a church, but I saw it online. Some of you were here. Magnificent explosion at this hour of music and testimony, and now we're back to Hebrews. Because the first verses of chapter 12 sit very nicely with the end of 11. 11 is, these Israelites had faith this way, and we should laud and magnify them and thank them for being as faithful as they were, and we can learn from them. But 12:1 and 2 are kind of like, it is our turn. It's our turn, the author of the Hebrews is saying. It's our time to do this, to venture, to risk in faith. And so this morning we take it, and I'm going to read it out for you, but we take it as sort of the next after that long, good series. And here's how it goes. The author of Hebrews writes, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses," all of those faithful people from chapter 11. I picture a World Cup stadium full of them, right? "Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus." Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." It's almost as if this author is saying, you want Faith Hall of Fame, I'll give you the author and perfecter of faith, and now our job is to keep our eyes fixed on him. Did you notice? We've got a cheer squad. We've got all these people who have come before us, all this cloud of witnesses that surrounds us and cheers us on. But we've also got this sin and other stuff that kind of catches our feet on the way, that entangles us. Our job as our turn is to fix our eyes on Jesus and run with perseverance the race. Right? So we're going to talk this morning about that passage as it leads us into what is it to be faithful as persons and as church in the context of conflict, both the sort of wider conflicts of our world and the more close and local conflicts about changes at church. So, that's a lot to do. Let's pray together, and then we'll rock on. Will you pray with me? May the words I say and the musings of all our hearts and minds be yours in this hour, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So we're talking this morning about focus. We're talking about a way to keep our eyes on Jesus even as things happen in our world around us. And you know, those hindrances and those entanglements of sin, when you hear those phrases, when you hear the things that hinder us and the sin which so easily entangles, what thought bubbles come up above your head? What do you see when you hear the word sin? Do you picture going to the cheating side of town? Do you picture taking the cookie from the cookie jar? Do you picture wronging a friend? What comes to your mind? I don't want you to speak it out. It's your thing, right? But what comes to your mind is probably different than what comes to my mind. Because in my experience across the nation and in different communities, my experience, it is a personal hindrance when those kinds of temptations hound us, right? A temptation to sexual infidelity or a temptation to cheat on our taxes or whatever. It is a hindrance to us. But as church, the ones that get us most, I think, are the distractions. The things that take our eyes away from Jesus. So we have a medieval tradition of 7 deadly sins, and they're see the skulls and all that nastiness, wrath and sloth and pride and greed and lust, gluttony and envy, right? Those are loud words. You can't say them quietly, really. That's the tradition, and they suppose that this encompasses all things. My experience has it that it's when we take our eyes off Jesus, when our eyes are drawn not by a squirrel or a flashing light, but by things that lead us away from the path. That's more of an encumbrance to a church, even than some of those personal temptations. And to get at that, I want to give you one of my favorite quotes in all the world. There's a guy named G.K. Chesterton. How many of you have watched the Father Brown mysteries on PBS? Or streamed them? Not many. There's homework. You've got to watch these. G.K. Chesterton wrote these Father Brown mysteries. So he was a philosopher and a theologian and a wordsmith, and he was pretty good at writing a mystery. But my favorite quotation from G.K. Chesterton is this. It's in the middle of the afternoon when all the food has been eaten and all the toys have been played with, that the children begin to torture the cat. It's in the middle of I'm not anti-cat, by the way, don't get me wrong. It's in the middle of the afternoon when all the food has been eaten and all the toys have been played with, that the children begin to torture the cat. What is he saying? Well, he's saying once we've lost our purpose and start to dilly-dally without one, we do harm. We do harm. We lose the thing that we were all doing together, and we turn on one another in a way. In this case, cats. In many cases, the kids start to fight one another, right? And I want to test that out on a phenomenon from American history. You know that the founders started by saying, we write this Constitution in order to form a more perfect union. Right? In order to form a more perfect union. Eyes on the prize, we're going to form a more perfect union. And it wasn't easy at first because they were separated states and they made their way through that early period and they started to figure out what it was to be a union. But then came the issue of slavery into the forefront, and we went to war in the bloodiest American war against one another. Right? And we came out of that, and Lincoln said that this war tests whether a nation can live the way we set out to do with all people are created equal and all of that, right? But we went after that, and pretty soon, in a sad way, we got help by 2 world wars. 2 world wars became a galvanizing identity piece for the American people. We went to war together, we sent our children off to war together, and we were at some level unified. If you know your history, there were anti-war protests, there were all those things, but on the whole, the 20th century, First World War, Second World War, brought the United States into more of a unified identity, and after that came into focus the Cold War. Do you have memory? Some of you are younger than the Cold War, right? You've been born since the early 90s, and so you don't have experiences. I remember watching in my dorm common room, watching a movie called The Day After. It was a nuclear winter movie, and we all, we're 19, 20, 21-year-old, and we're all completely scared that this is actually going to happen, that Russia is going to, the USSR is going to nuke us, and then we'll nuke in response, and everything will be gone. We didn't take it as anti-nuke. We took it as Cold War, and we were scared under our beds, right? The Cold War brought us into the place where we had a common enemy as a nation. And we didn't have everything in common, but we had that in common, and somehow it drew us together. Some of the most unified times in American history, according to sociologists, came during that period between the mid-50s and the mid-70s, just that stretch of time, right? But then the wall came down. 1989 in Germany, the wall comes down, and the Soviet Union fully dissolves in the early 90s, and everything changes. I've got a chart here, and it's not Rorschach test for you. I think you're going to see the red-blue chart. Yeah, there we go. It's not a Rorschach test for you. You don't have to tell me if you see a cloud or a ducky or whatever it is. But I want you to notice, it's kind of vague, but at the top are the 70s into the 80s second row, and I want you to notice these are the way people voted in Washington. Red and blue intermingled in that first set, right? And then they get a little bit apart in the second set. But then when we get to the 90s, in that third row, look how distinct blue and red have become. The end of the Cold War marked a huge escalation. And by the way, this chart only goes to 2011. Have things gotten a little more polarized since then? I'll say most people trace it to 2016. Look what it was doing before 2016, just because we no longer had a common enemy. And so we started to fight each other. We needed an enemy. The blues look good to the reds. The red look good to the blues. We'll be each other's enemies. Right? And it wasn't as noticeable as it is now, but you can tell that there was a huge change in the way that we did life. And so during that stretch and up to the present, we went from sort of reddish, bluish nation to very, very strictly divided. And I've shared this before, but 65% of parents in our day, in 2022, 65% of parents would be pretty upset if their child married somebody from the other side of the political aisle. Think of that for a second. 65%. Over 50% of us say that, people from that other party are a little bit less moral than the rest of us. And over a third of us say the people from the other party are a little bit less intelligent than the rest of us. Which means, and we've done this before, when you disagree with me, my recourse is to think you're either stupid or evil. Right? We've backed ourselves into that corner, and we make friends on each side. We hear our echo chambers. We hear the people who agree with us. We seek the news that agrees with us. We've talked about this before, but it's worth rehashing because it is the land in which we live. Our training for how to do things is built on having an us and a them that isn't supposed to get resolved. Right? That's how we're trained. When we enter church, that's how we're trained. It's no wonder that $17 billion have been spent on the election this year. $17 billion. You know what that is? That's the gross domestic product of Jamaica. 17 billion on this election, because what if their people, if I'm a red, what if the blues get in power? Or if I'm a blue, what if the reds get in power? We're in deep trouble. The whole world's going to come to an end. We need to spend more money and win, because who knows what will happen, right? We're scared of one another. We're distant from one another. And the outcome is that we just can't fathom one another. Our pattern is to pal with the people who agree with us. Now our common enemy is one another. Do you see that shift? The shift from an external power being the common enemy to an internal one. In my experience, there are two ways to build unity. One is by seeking a common enemy. And by the way, I have prayed for an alien invasion. Right? It would bring all of us together at least. Not really, but one is to find a common enemy and galvanize, as we don't know who else we are, but we're the people who don't like that. We don't like them. We fear them, or we hate them, or whatever it is. And I'll tell you, that sort of ethos, that way of doing the world, has seeped into the church mightily. What's the problem? Well, the problem is those progressive Christians. No. The problem is those evangelicals, right? It's seeped into the church that the real enemy is actually part of the church. And now let's bring it back even to this room, right? Even to this room and this church. There have been changes at Riverbend. And those changes have prompted some sort of nasty response. Some people, you'll get to the place where I am not sort of here to defend the establishment. I'm not here to say the leaders got it right, and if you're against it, you got it wrong, this way or the highway. Not at all. You'll find that out. But there are people who have grown upset about the changes. And by the way, let's put it in context. We've been going through changes since 2020 in March. We've been changing our lives as church in a lot of ways in which we didn't agree. Masks, no masks. Vaccines, no vaccines. Right? That was a tension then, and in some ways continues to be in places. But stack on that, now, because of the way the migratory patterns are going, we've changed to having 2 services instead of 3, and it is hard for some people, but I want to ask, what do we do when it's hard? How do we behave when we disagree on something like this? Because we know what the world is teaching us to do. The world is teaching us to pal around with the people who agree with us and throw grenades at the other side. And here's how that usually goes in a case like this. In a case like this, the church decides something, the church leadership decides something, like two instead of 3 worship services, like personnel decisions, like right, a handful of things. And the people who don't like it find other people who don't like it and build their ire. And then they send zingy emails or whatever it is, and they do their sort of opposition from a distance. Then this group galvanizes itself and starts looking down at that group. This is very common, right? We live to be superior. In fact, the conflicts that the early Christian disciples, the people who followed Jesus, had, we have 3 or 4 conflicts between them, 3 or 4 arguments. All of them have something to do with who's greatest among them. We love to be superior. And so in this back and forth, we've got superiority on the stay the same, don't change side. And then we've got superiority on the change, don't stay the same side. And we are now 2 camps. Now, as I said at the beginning, you may be relatively untouched by this. Or you may be in one of those 2 camps. What I want to try on this morning is a second image. Because if one way of galvanizing and unifying is to choose a common enemy, another way to do it is to choose a common purpose. You see the difference? Common enemy. Aristotle said that the strangest of people, and here it is, a common danger unites even the bitterest of enemies. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? I choose a common enemy with somebody and we array ourselves. That will make us unified even if we differ in a lot of ways, right? But the problem with that is we're making one another the enemies. So a second alternative is a common purpose? What are we looking toward? What are we trying for? What are we hoping to build? And then we get back to fixing our eyes on Jesus. Because you notice how little Jesus came into play as I was describing American polarization and then church dynamics? I don't think I mentioned his name once until I mentioned that the disciples were trying to one-up one another. It doesn't look a lot like Jesus. Jesus didn't do that kind of thing, and he didn't call his disciples to do that kind of thing. Naming common enemies was his bane. He would go out and find the people everybody didn't like. He would tell a story about a good Samaritan when everybody hated the Samaritans. Right? Jesus was anti-common enemy. He was pro-common purpose. And so I want to ask, what does it look like for a small culture of a church within a large culture that has clearly chosen common enemies? What does it look like to be a purposeful lot? To fix our eyes on Jesus and run this race, stripping off the hindrances and sin that entangle. What does it look to be that? And I'm going to do it in 3 words. I don't usually do 3 points, and I don't usually do sort of acronyms, but here we go. B-E-T, bet. Point 1 is give the benefit of the doubt, B. I want you to think for a second the last time that somebody looked at you and listened to you, giving you the benefit of the doubt. You know what I mean by this? Trusting that you were trying to get things right. I want you to think back to the last time that was and how you felt when that happened. What did it feel like for somebody to trust you enough to give you that benefit and not suspect that you were trying to pull one over on them? It's a pretty good feeling. To be trusted, to be given the benefit of the doubt is a pretty good feeling, but it's not that common in our culture. Levels of trust are at an all-time low among sociologists and social psychologists. We suspect our neighbors. We look for what yard signs they have, and if they have certain yard signs, we stay our distance, right? I bet some of that goes on in the parking lot with bumper stickers, right? We are at a suspicious place. What if churches became, what if during this change that we're going through that's spinning our heads, what if churches became, and this church became, a place where you could count on the benefit of the doubt? Refreshing? I'm going to listen long enough for you to prove me wrong, but I'm going to think that you're trying to get this right. And in fact, I've been in a lot of churches over the last 5 or 6 years. I haven't found anybody who's trying to get Jesus wrong. Right? So benefit of the doubt is actually not a bad first step. E, empathy. What do I mean by empathy? Well, American culture has resorted to something called selective empathy. You're only worth my empathy if you've earned it. So Antonin Scalia dies, and one part of our population says his family doesn't deserve our empathy because of all those rulings he made in the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies, who's a progressive, and all the other people say her people don't deserve our empathy. We're selective. We think you have to earn our understanding or earn our empathy. I want to take you to a moment. I do these courageous conversations with mixed red-blue crowds. I was doing one in Scottsdale 3 or 4 years ago, and we were doing climate change, and it happened to be when a measure was up or a referendum was up or some kind of decision was being made in Arizona about climate change law, right? And the people were at it. So I've got 100 people in the room, and probably 6 to 4 blue to red, but it was close to 50-50, right? And they're going back and forth, and they get a little antsy at one another, and red faces and spit coming out. And so I said, let's slow down. And I said, let's take 90 seconds. Let's take 90 seconds and just imagine the person who is on the other side of this issue from you. And do you know how long 90 seconds seems when it's quiet in a room full of 100 people? If I did that now, you'd be, by the end of it, you'd be so awkward. 90 seconds is a long time, but they did it. And as it was closing, I looked in the back, and there was a woman there whom I knew well enough to know she might be willing to tell her story. And so I asked, Elizabeth, I saw that you're weeping. Would you happen to be willing to tell us? And she said, Alan, I am a climate change activist. I'm a person who lives to make the generations after us have a good life on this planet. I go and do that. It's a primary part of who I am. So for 90 seconds, I pictured what it would be to be a West Virginia miner who's barely putting food on the table for his family and can't think. It would be a luxury to think one generation out, much less 3 or 4. And I sat there picturing him, scared that I'm going to take his job away by what I'm advocating. And I just started to weep, and I couldn't help it, and I started to sob, and I couldn't help it. And she paused, and then she said, Alan, it didn't change my point of view about the issue. I still feel strongly about it. It certainly changed my point of view about him and about the people who advocate for him. Do you see empathy happening there? She was understanding herself in the shoes of the person on the other side of an issue, and suddenly she wasn't mad at him. She was sympathetic toward him, and she wanted to talk to him. That's empathy. So we've got benefit of the doubt. I'm going to believe that you mean well until you prove me wrong. Empathy, I'm going to step into your shoes, and I'm going to try to understand you from your side. The third is the T, and it's toward. Here's where it's hard. Going toward somebody you disagree with or who disagrees with you is risky business in American culture right now. Right? It's risky business to venture across the line because we know how we treat each other behind closed doors. Right? We talk about them in ways that are dehumanizing sometimes. Well, I've become the them in this conversation. It takes guts to go across that line, and so we venture it with trepidation, but we have to venture it if we're going to make headway. It's true of the red-blue situation in American culture. I watch people brave these courageous conversations, and they're always surprised that there have been no fatalities, right? That's how scared we are of one another. And they come away and they actually make friends from the other side after a while. In church, in this church, as we process this change and these conflicts and any that come in the time ahead, it's going to be very important for us to trust enough to brave crossing the issue. To find the person who is upset if you're an okay with the hour thing, okay with the new worship scheme thing. Or to find the person who is okay with it if we're against it, and sit down and try to understand one another. Move toward instead of into our echo chamber groups. That is a hard and risky thing. But I can tell you from experience, and I can tell you from utter hopes about this church and all churches, that as I look around and see how this goes, benefit of the doubt, empathy, and moving toward change lives. They change trajectories, and they allow us to get our eyes back on Jesus, fixing our eyes on Jesus, scraping away the hindrances, becoming again Christ's church, becoming again the followers of Jesus, instead of somebody who's been taking our world script. I want to close. This happens so often, and Dave will attest, and the other preachers will attest. It happens so often. You're building a sermon, and you kind of do your thing, and then you get to something that happens 2 or 3 days before, and it becomes a prime illustration. And you think, that's so nice of you, God, right? I want to close with a story that happened at the Thanksgiving table. At the Thanksgiving table, we had a grave thing announced. I am an in-law in this town. My wife Liz was born and raised here. Her parents live in central Austin in this lovely big Georgian house that he designed. It's been there 40 years or so. And every holiday we spend with her parents and her 2 brothers and their families. And so we've got all kinds of memory. I've been doing it 22 years. They've been doing it longer than I have, right? So we sit down to dinner at Thanksgiving, and the patriarch says, I have an announcement. This may be our last holiday dinner here because Karen and I have decided that we're going to look into next level housing where we can get more help, right? Transitional into deeper levels of care. Right? And the place goes sad. It's Thanksgiving dinner. We've known this on the outside for a while, but the place goes somber. And we start to share nostalgic stories, and that's good. And we share what we're thankful for, and a lot of them gravitate to, oh, it's been so great to have these wonderful family holiday meals. And yet it was somber. It was sad. And then my 21-year-old nephew, Trevor, stops the whole thing and says, you guys, you got to listen to me. I love this place, and this news is brand new to me. I love those meals. I love everything you're remembering. But those things are not about the table, and they're not about this house. Those things are about us, and we can do them anywhere. We are family anywhere, in any situation, and the whole table just went, whoa, because truth had landed. Friends, churches change. Worlds change. And we're the family of God anyway. And the family of God can be the family of God whatever time we worship. We can be the family of God even while we're disagreeing about whatever time we worship. We have one another, will travel through history now for 2,000 years. Trevor brought the truth. We fix our eyes on Jesus. We love one another, come what may. Amen? Amen.